I mean, first of all, Professor, thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. And one of the first things I wanted to talk about, I think, was is seeds, right? Beginnings, and one thing that I'm fascinated by is starting as a undergraduate student in physics at Amherst, and then switching to history, of modern Europe and science. And I want to ask, what was that specific moment, or maybe it was a progression over time where you started to shift your trajectory.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and thank you very much again for uh, offering me the opportunity to discuss my career and my interests. It's a real honor and quite flattering. So I
It's good
hope
to
I can
hear.
live up to your expectations and the expectations of your listeners, and I don't waste their time. Um, so yeah, well, I'd always been interested in history of science ever since I had watched Jacob Bronowski's television series, The Ascent of Man, which was a PBS series that came out when I was just 10. I was completely fascinated by it, but I had a romanticized notion of science and scientists, and even though I was interested in the humanities, I didn't think it was a respectable thing for any intelligent person to study. So I signed up for uh, a major in physics, but after a couple of years of studying that, I realized that my attitude towards the humanities was silly. But I suppose due to a personality flaw, I was too proud to switch majors. I didn't want to quit,
Yeah.
so I just
Yeah.
slogged it out. Even though about by the second year, I realized I probably didn't want to become a physicist. But if there was a moment, turning point where I shifted my trajectory is when I realized how much time I was spending reading history of science books that I was supposed to be shelving from the truck of returned books that uh, was my duty to shelve in the library. I had a job
Yeah.
working in the library. So ended up standing there reading all these books off the truck, and my poor boss, God bless him, Mr. Morton, would do my work for me because I spent half the time I was working, reading, and standing. And then I realized I'm really interested in this, and it's okay to study it. So um, after I graduated, I applied for history in grad school. Let me add, by the way, that I don't think that the cast of mind of studying science and history is all that different, actually. They're both empirical disciplines. Science is trying to study the natural world, and history is trying to study the human world. Um, but they're not deductive. They're not like math or maybe philosophy in
Mm.
their approaches. So it wasn't that hard a switch methodologically. It's just you're studying a different set of problems with a different set of materials, but the basic approach I find is quite similar.
Yeah, and one thing that always kind of fascinates me, I guess, is how you were talking about they're both kind of similar in the sense, studying history versus studying science. And one thing I ask myself is, like, even as an undergraduate student, do I want to be what I'm studying now? And I have to agree, I don't think I will. I don't think I am. I don't think when I go for school in college is necessarily what I might be doing 20, 40 years from now. But I think, in a sense, looking at both studying physics and or history, I think it gives you a skill set to look at things critically and to think about things critically. And I wonder, once you went to grad school for history, what were some of the things that were different that maybe you found interesting and or challenging switching from studying physics to history?
Right. Um, so, I was quite intimidated going to grad school because I didn't have a strong background in history.
Yeah.
I felt there were a lot of people who knew a lot more history, to say the least, were better writers. Um, maybe had better aptitude. So I kind of felt really insecure. But um, I think you're right. Like undergraduate education, I can't stress this enough. It's, in my opinion, it's not meant to professionalize you. That's what graduate school is for. In my opinion, it really doesn't matter what you study, what you major in as an undergrad, because any of the academic subjects can teach you how to think. Mark Twain made the same argument that if you study anything long and hard enough, you'll sort of end up at the same basic questions. Your just approaches might differ slightly. Um, so I think I was fortunate in that I had learned how to think, and the methods that were then being touted as the next direction in my field, history of science, seemed very natural to me. They were emphasizing culture, they're emphasizing context, they're emphasizing looking at science uh, not just as a development of the history of ideas or not just as methods of experiment, but also as a human project, social project that was embedded in the society. And that seemed quite natural to me. So um, let me offer now a slightly more cynical take on studying culture or cultural history of science. Um, it was only later that I realized that the evolution in focus was to a large extent a consequence of source material.
Mm.
Because the first thing historians do is they read books and newspapers. They read the printed sources because they're the most readily available and the easiest to read. And if you read printed sources, you write intellectual history. Okay. And then the next harder step is they go to archives and they read manuscript material, that is materials written by hand. But they read the stuff there's a lot of it that's organized and it's legible, often written by professional scribes. And that results in a kind of institutional history, which was the history that was being done in the 1970s, immediately prior to my entry into grad school. So what they were touting was cultural history, which I thought made perfect sense. But what actually, in practice, what that meant was I needed to go to an archive and read all this stuff that was really hard to read, like
Mm.
correspondence,
Yeah.
diaries, very obscure periodicals. And that I will say cultural history gives maybe, in my opinion, the best picture of science because it reveals context and motivations, but it's really hard to do. It is very difficult to read handwriting from the
Yeah.
past that's not written by a scribe, and moreover, that's written in a foreign language. And in my case, because I did German, it's not even written in the Latin alphabet.
Yeah.
It's written in this Gothic script that you
Yeah.
have to learn how to read it. So um, it's I think it's a little ironic that the evolution of kinds of history or a lot of intellectual evolution is often driven by really mundane considerations like what's doable or what's the easiest to do.
Yeah.
Uh, so, and then I wrote a biography because my advisor had written to, and he said, "Oh, that's an ideal format for a dissertation." He said they were limited in scope. He couldn't have been more wrong. My biography took me 25 years to write, so I was quite angry at him halfway through it because I thought, man, I want to be done with this thing. But I slogged again. I'm stubborn. I slogged through and I finally finished it.
And speaking of your, when you get to the doctoral level, you and your PhD at Princeton, great school, and also at the same time the 1990s, right? And this
Yeah.
was such a evolutionary time, at least to me when I look back. The 1990s I think had some of the most greatest unintended consequences, in my opinion, for what we experience now in human history in the present. And I wonder, when you were at Princeton for your doctoral degree, how did your academic environment shape your approach to blending history and science, two fields that you had studied in? And once you got to, the doctoral level? How was that for you?
Um, yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, back then, history of science programs generally required that you indeed have an undergraduate degree in science.
Mm,
You know, now that the discipline is a little more independent, they don't ask that. So everyone who was there had had some scientific training.
mm,
Um, but this is an institutional story. We were kind of an independent program from the history department. Okay. So when I first went there, it was sort of like what we would call STS, Science Technology Society. They
mm,
had an interdisciplinary approach to studying science, and I thought that was cool.
yeah.
I was most interested in history, but I had nothing against anthropological or philosophical approaches. And then here's a funny story that people don't know. Um, the director of my program um, got in an academic fight with the professors in the program because he wanted to do this interdisciplinary approach and they wanted to do history.
Mm.
Okay. And he lost that fight and he left and he set up an SDS program in San Diego. So when I first arrived in graduate school, I got this note in my mailbox that said, "Hi, welcome, and I'm gone. I'll be teaching, you know, I'll be setting up this new program in San Diego. Good luck with your career." And now you're a history graduate student. We basically we got absorbed into the history department. They just took us over. So, that's a like anything in history, a lot of times it can't be foreseen. It's just accidental. So, right.
Yeah.
So I was basically trained not in philosophy of science or anthropology of science, but I was trained purely in history. Um, but everyone there had had a science background, so I guess you could say I had to pick up the other disciplinary approaches maybe a little bit later.
Mm. Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up how it kind of got absorbed entirely into history, right?
Right.
And with your work focusing so much on the history of science, I kind of wonder, when you really started getting into the disciplinary actions of strictly history, what were some challenges, especially like research wise? I wonder like some of the comparing and contrasting between researching maybe science versus researching history.
Well, I don't, man, I don't know what scientists do other than anecdotally from my friends and colleagues who are scientists, right? They tell,
Yeah,
and um, so I can't, I never worked as a scientist, so I can't speak to that.
yeah.
Um, but um, researching history, uh, I mean, most of it is pretty mundane.
Mm,
It's just basically gathering information. You read a lot
yeah,
and then organizing it topically, and trying to pull themes out of that information so that you can tell a compelling story or make a compelling argument.
yeah.
So it's a lot of academic work uh, is in fact pretty mundane.
Mm,
There's not a lot of great thoughts, brilliant insights that go into your day-to-day work. You're just reading and trying to assimilate information and then trying to see patterns, basically. So I'm sorry to give you such a kind of maybe a letdown answer, but I think this is true in general. Like a lot of work is pretty basic, pretty uh, sort of not very flashy, but
yeah,
you have to do that. You have to do that in order to have the foundation to see patterns and to make insights, and then that part is really super exciting, actually.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to get into some of the things that you've written about because I think, well, they're fascinating. And one that I saw a lot of and that I made a note to ask about was you've written a lot about the 19th century German scientist Émile Dubois-Reymond.
Hmm.
And for people who have never heard of him, because I have never heard of him before, why
Right.
should we care about his life and his work today? And I wonder like what you have gained from researching him.
Sure. All right. So let me tell you the story of this guy. So I was in this, first year um, seminar that was covering historiography of science, the methodological approach to doing history of science. And the professor is teaching that class, who's now retired. Her name's Catherine Olesko. She retired from Georgetown. She's a historian of physics and a historian of German physics, and she was telling an interesting story about 19th century German physics, about the origin of the idea of energy conservation, which is a big scientific idea in the 19th century. And then she talked about this group of physiologists, actually, uh, who three of whom were in Berlin. That's the guy I wrote about, Emile Dubois-Reymond. He's a French name because he's of Huguenot descent. That's French Protestant descent.
Mm.
There were a lot of Huguenot immigrants that came to, or they were invited to Prussia after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which was the Edict of Toleration in 1685. So these French Protestants, they went everywhere. They went to the United States, Britain, the Netherlands, but they also went to Berlin. So quite a few of them ended up there, and that's his background. But him, a friend of his named Ernst Brücke was another physiologist who got a job in Vienna. He was Freud's teacher. And then the one you might have heard of, Hermann von Helmholtz, who's like very important physicist and physiologist. They sort of formed a group of mechanistic reductionist physiologists or biologists, and that out of that, the context of that group of young scientists, Helmholtz in 1847 came up with this idea of energy conservation. So basically, what Professor Olesko was suggesting was that there was a religious, that is, an anti-clerical and medical background to the formulation of this scientific law. And I just found that totally fascinating. Like, I'd never heard of that. I didn't know that 19th century German physics had any connections to medicine or religious issues. Basically, energy conservation was a way for Helmholtz to argue that you don't need the supernatural or concepts of the divine in living beings because everything that goes on can be accounted for thermodynamically. That was his argument. So there's
Mm.
like no need for supernatural intervention. Okay. So after that lecture, I went up to the teacher and I said, I've never heard of these guys. Tell me more. And Professor Olesko said, oh, this would make a good dissertation topic. And I said, okay. So there, it's like April 1987, and I've basically been, I'm still working on this guy. Okay. Um, so let me tell you more. That's a little backstory. Let me tell you more about, who is Emile Dubois-Reymond. Basically, he was a professor of physiology in Berlin, and then he was also a spokesman for science. He wrote a lot of essays and he gave a lot of lectures. He was kind of a public figure. So basically, you can think of him alongside Darwin, Charles
Mhm.
Darwin in England, and this other guy named Claude Bernard in France. Dubois-Reymond was one of the three most prominent biologists of his day. He was really famous. His you could buy pictures of him in shop windows in Berlin, like you'd buy a
Mm.
poster of a rock star. The scientists were on and the scholars were on one side, and the royal family was on the other. So these were like appropriate, right? And what did he do? Well, he effectively invented modern neuroscience, in
Mm.
my opinion, uh, by perfecting the measurement of electrical impulses in nerves and muscles. So he started a whole instrumental approach that is still used today in neuroscience. Neuroscience basically has, three approaches. It has an anatomical approach where you're looking at structure. You could argue it has this, biochemical approach where you're looking at neurotransmitters. And then finally, it has this applied physics approach, which was congenial to me, where there's instruments that are measuring the electrical activity and in the nervous system. So that's what he did. And as I mentioned, he also wrote for a popular audience, and there his most famous essays express what I mentioned, his mechanistic view of biology. And second, and this was what he's perhaps most famous for, his claim that science was limited and there would never be a science of consciousness, that science
Mm.
can never understand the mind. And that remains a controversial issue in philosophy of mind today.
And one thing I find interesting about Raymond, I think, is your argument that he started effectively the study of neuroscience and the brain. And I wonder, within studying him, I wonder if there were surprising things that you learned while researching, the history of neuroscience and the brain through Raymond, and did it challenge anything that you had previously thought within your life?
Yes. So thank you for asking this question because I'm proud of what I discovered. Let
Mm.
me tell you, if I may be so bold, it's really rare for historians to discover anything. I mean, generally, the historical record is pretty well known, and what historians do is they add new interpretations. They find, different takes on the evidence. They may find a different bunch of material that sheds new light on the evidence, but it's rare that they actually find new things. But nonetheless, I think I discovered like three things in the course of my research. First,
Mm.
I discovered that this guy, Emile du Bois-Reymond, he was the first scientist to convert to Darwinism, which is quite surprising because he was a physiologist. You
Yeah.
would think that a naturalist would be the first, but no, he was the first. And moreover, his understanding of Darwin was really modern. And he taught the theory for decades as part of his sort of a general course on the history of science in Berlin. So he read The Origin of Species just a couple months after it was published, and he was converted almost immediately. And then, within a year, he was teaching this stuff. So most, let me tell you, there are thousands of people who have worked on Darwin, and I had not seen this anywhere among any of the research. So that for people interested in Darwin, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
I found the first German Darwinist. Um, Second, I mean, Dubois was this amazing polymath. He was interested in a lot. And I found that he was one of the first scholars of nationalism. Actually, as
Mm.
far as I can tell, the third scholar of nationalism. He was also one of the first Germans to study the Enlightenment, along with Nietzsche and a couple others. And he was a major innovator in my field, which is cultural history. He argued that we shouldn't study battles, we should study the history of culture, which is quite innovative.
Yeah.
In fact, he said, and what we should study in the history of culture, we should study science. He said it's the only aspect of culture that shows any progress. So he formulated the tenets of my own discipline, the history of science, in 1877, which is quite remarkable. And then finally, I discovered he had some important influences, right? Or rather, people were inspired or provoked by his work, and this isn't also not very well known. For example, I think the most important thing I found out was in 1867, William James, Henry James's brother, William James is considered the father of American psychology. He went to Berlin to study with Du Bois-Reymond. This is not widely known. Uh, he wanted to learn electrophysiology and neuroscience because he wanted to understand the mind, and he just, I can't say this any other way, he just flunked out.
Mm.
He, I looked at his notes, and he stopped taking notes after a while, and then there's just a bunch of doodles, and then he quit. Okay.
Mm.
So, but then what I found out thereafter is that a lot of James's early writings can be understood as a response to his unpleasant experience of flunking out,
Yeah.
and also to the arguments that Du Bois was making. He really didn't like the conclusions that Du Bois was drawn to, and so you can think of James's writing as a reaction to Du Bois. And
Yeah.
then I found there were other um, philosophers maybe people are less aware, like Nietzsche or Wittgenstein or other early 20th century philosophers who were effectively Freud, another example, not a philosopher, but a thinker who were reacting to Du Bois-Reymond's popular essays. So I found that he played a much larger role, you could say, in intellectual history than I had expected.
Yeah, and seeing these like interconnected ideas, thoughts, stories, and people within this time period, it's fascinating because one thing I kind of think about when we start thinking about these influential people within science during this time is, looking at how we now in the present can explore this, and especially with you, you've explored how science and society were connected within the 19th century. And do you think science today still has that same kind of influence on people like it did then? Because I think, Raymond can be kind of a cultural significance within the history of science at this time. And I wonder, does that still have a chance of happening today with how advanced it's gotten?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can only speculate because I'm not an expert on contemporary science and its impact. But
Yeah,
from what I could tell, it's still all over the internet, and people are buying popular books, and there are podcasts by scientists, and it is no less controversial
yeah,
than it has ever been, as you well know. I mean, the difference is it takes a lot more expertise to understand it, obviously, than it did in the 19th century. So, the bar for really following the debates is higher,
yeah,
but um, they're still out there, and I don't think that um, its role has diminished at all.
yeah. And, I wonder also at the same time, though, do you think that when we look at history, um, I wouldn't say history. I think when we look at like, today's world, when we look at the news and we look how things are kind of also communicated throughout the world, do you also think that the way that science was communicated back then, what do you think some of the differences are? Obviously we could go technologically wise, but also I think now, do you think there's a difference in how history is communicated? Because that's one of the questions I have is the way that, science is communicated throughout our world now versus maybe in the 18th century during Raymond's time.
Right. So yeah, back then people read more. I mean, there was less distraction, obviously. There wasn't
Mm,
radio and television and the internet, so they read a lot more. By the end of the 19th century, literacy was pretty high,
yeah.
even among poor people. So um, everyone was reading it. In particular, let me say that uh, leftist progressives in Germany saw science as the champion of their movement.
Mm,
So they were really paying attention to it because they were anti-clerical. They were against older institutional forms like the church and the state, and they wanted
yep.
to change things. So right, people were paying attention. One of the things Du Bois did to make money was run around and offer popular lectures.
Mm,
Okay. He married a rich woman from South America of German descent who grew up in England. So he had a very cosmopolitan household.
yeah.
But I found out there was this war between Chile and Peru in 1878 called the War of the Pacific. I didn't know about that. Basically over mining. And he lost all of his investment. And
Mm,
he had a really large family, had 9 kids. So he needed money in his 50s. He needed to earn a lot of money. So he went around and gave popular lectures, and then people used to pay him for that. Um, Sometimes I was envious of him. I'd like to run around and earn money that way. But
yeah.
but basically, well, effectively, people are doing the same thing now. Like, I don't know if you're earning any money from this podcast, but there are people who make a living from podcasts now, right?
Yeah.
So in that respect, it's not that different. People are listening to popular presentations of topics that are conducted by experts, and good communicators. And then when they want to find out more, they read, newspaper articles or journals or books, or they join groups and chat with them. And it's okay. The mediums might be different. There's fewer
Yeah.
people writing letters, but it's not, I don't think things have changed that much.
It's interesting too because I think, even though mediums have changed, like you said, I still think in a sense it's all really same foundationally,
Right.
I you can look online within social media and podcasts and short form content, and that's how a lot of people get their information nowadays, whether it be about the news or whatever it may be. And still, I think that has the same foundational holdings as articles within newspapers back then, And one thing that, that I've kind of looked at and have not really challenged, but just kind of acknowledges the fact that I think this is how it's going to be for the rest of time, however that may look like 100 years from now, all the way to the 22nd century, I think it's still going to be foundationally the same. It's just, the mediums of which that information is transferred, um, is different. But one thing I do want to get to is kind
Okay.
of kind of more of a broader sense of what you've taught, as a professor. And so, one thing I find interesting is seeing, looking at research interests, but also what classes people teach. And, one thing I'm interested is that you have taught courses like The World at War, World War One, World War Two, weapons of mass destruction, and I wonder, when you teach classes like this, whatever classes it may be, what are a few things that you hope students really take away from these classes? Maybe it be information or even critical thinking skills, especially in a time like this, when global conflict and technology are so immediate. They are just everywhere. You go on social media, you turn on the news, you read something is one of the main things that is written, talked about, videoed about. What are some of the main things you want people to take away when students take your classes?
Sure. So a lot of people take that core class, The World at War, because it fulfills international perspectives
Yeah.
as a requirement. I think it's a little ironic that killing people is it's an approach to international perspective. It's
Yeah.
bleak. Class is bleak. Um, I teach that class because, well, quite honestly, it fills seats. People are interested in it. Second, it's important. I think also we need to bear witness to the pain and suffering and the death of all those people. So I think it's a valuable class. It's not my, to be honest, it's not my favorite topic to teach because
Yeah.
it's so bleak. I wish I could teach about all the wonderful things in culture that I like to study, like art and music and literature and science. But, this also happened in the 20th century, these terrible wars that killed 80 to 100 million people. Um, and people need to know about them.
Yeah.
So here's what, here's a common preconception that I find myself um, trying to overturn. There are a lot of people that come to those topics and they've watched TV shows that obsess with military technology,
Mm.
okay? Tanks or battleships, etc. Well, um, technology played a smaller role in those conflicts than people generally suspect. For example, conventional bombing by the Allies killed many, many more Japanese than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, when I broach the history of the decision to use atomic weapons, I try to put it in the context of a whole campaign of strategic bombing that arose out of a policy of unconditional surrender that arose out of the experience of the First World War. And um, how can I put this succinctly? What I'm trying to convey is the question, should we or should we have not used nuclear weapons, is probably less pertinent than the question of what was the context in which they were used, And maybe the question is, should we or should we have not even fought
Mm.
altogether? Because once we decided to fight Japan and Nazi Germany, we weren't going to stop until they completely surrendered. And in the case of Japan, they were very reluctant to surrender.
Yeah.
So I hope students understand that there's enormous cost, economic, moral, and just truly in terms of pain and suffering in using violence to resolve international conflicts. And I hope they think twice before they support our entry into any war.
Yeah, I think it's a cultural thing. I mean, I take a look at all the times that so the major times that the United States of America has entered a global conflict. Primarily we can look at World War One and World War Two. And I think it's a cultural thing for Americans to look at America as the main superpower of the world to step in and stop things. And I think we still think that about ourselves. Whether it may be true or not is not the point. I think the point is that we seem to accept, like, and egg on the fact that we insert ourselves into everything around the world as America. And I think that's a great, introspective question to kind of ponder on the idea of being reluctant to enter conflicts, even within the modern day. And so I wonder also, thinking about a question like that, did questions like that arise, and did those beliefs change, growing up in general? I mean, you could, look at yourself from when you were a undergrad student all the way up to doctoral area, and I wonder, like, do did those questions arise, and if they did your beliefs on them change, especially,
Oh,
history?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was a kid, this was during the Cold War. I was a staunch anti-communist. I thought America was the, bastion of liberty. And then in grad school, I took a class on the history of the atomic bomb, and I came away with a much more critical view of our use of weapons of mass destruction. And then I continued to read the literature on that.
Mm.
And the more recent military history has shaped my view yet again. I'm kind of now a reluctant defender of the use to use atomic weapons, given what I know about Japanese leadership at the end of the war. So, um, uh, basically there are big swings, maybe you could say,
Yeah.
in progress thesis, antithesis, and now I'm sort of closer to a kind of synthesis. Now I'm a reluctant or skeptical defender of the use of those weapons. To me, the question is not should we or shouldn't we have not used the weapons. That is the central question. It's should we have even gotten involved in the war to begin with, given that it was going to result in um, our prosecuting a policy that was really destructive. And I don't, the fact is, I don't think there are easy answers to this. What
Yeah.
we did was terrible. On the other hand, um, there are costs to not intervening. People, for example, were very unfamiliar with the record of loss of life in East Asia.
Yeah.
Most Americans are more familiar with the European side of things, the Holocaust, and what the Nazis did in occupied territory in the East. But what the Japanese did in China and uh, other countries was equally appalling, and we tend to forget that.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. I don't think there are easy answers. I just want to get students to think and debate and draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, and one thing, since we're getting into this more, contemporary part of history, I wanted to ask, because I'm fascinated by this, but from your perspective, what's the biggest misconception people might have about modern German history, particularly post-war Germany. I'm fascinated by looking at the evolution of Germany, especially we can go back to even with Raymond in the 19th century with, in Berlin and seeing that progression of Germany all the way up to World War II and Nazi Germany, and then afterwards with East and West, and then all the way up to now. I think especially the modern politics of Germany are fascinating. And so I kind of wonder, what's the biggest misconception people have about modern Germany, particularly post-war? Especially I think some of the most interesting things are the way that its foreign policy has changed,
Hmm.
and particularly I think also the politics of Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt. I think they're all kind of interconnected now. I would make an argument that they were more separate back then, but I just wonder your perspective on that.
Sure. So let me preface this by saying that I ended up living in Germany for 7 years
Mm,
in Berlin from 1987. I first started going there. I moved there permanently in 1990, and I stayed there till the end of 1995. So I spent about six and a half years in Berlin and about 6 months in this other town called Göttingen. So my answers are informed by that experience and also what I know of German history. So
mm,
here's the biggie for, say, before World War II. The big surprise is that actually Germany wasn't that anti-Semitic prior to um, the Second World War, at least not compared with other countries like, say, France or Russia. Nonetheless, that didn't stop them from wiping out most of the Jews of Europe.
yeah,
So here the point is I think it's really important for people to understand that genocides are less the product of hatred and ignorance than they are the result of weak institutions, maybe crass self-interest and
mm,
indifference. And I think that is telling because you could take that insight and apply it to America today.
mm,
Um, I don't think the issue in America, this is just an opinion, is so much as rampant racism as an issue of weak institutions, maybe self-interest and indifference.
yeah,
Um, okay, and then to answer your other question about post-war Germany, I did a field in economic history, so I think the most common perception of post-war Germany is it's this economic powerhouse, right?
yeah,
Given how far it came from the destruction at the end of the Second World War to today. So here's a couple points. What people may not be aware of is that most of the industrial infrastructure in Germany was intact at the end of the Second World War, about 80%. And the reason that their economy was in the shambles was because the transport network was destroyed. So this speaks to the importance of the Marshall Plan. What the Marshall Plan did was it didn't rebuild German industry as much as provide kind of like food uh, and help for Germany to repair its railways, canals, road networks, etc. And then once it did that, it had the capacity to take off again. Um, and there is a lot admirable in German economic practices, such as they have an educational system of apprenticeships,
mm,
which offer young people an alternative to just simply going to college and studying liberal arts. They can learn a skilled trade, and it's free.
yeah,
And people in skilled trades they can do really well. And
yeah,
we should do this personally. Their labor unions are much stronger than ours. That's also true in France and many other places in Europe, and I think that's a good thing too. Um, and they emphasize small businesses maybe more than we do, and that emphasis on enterprise I think is really important because it gives a good broad basis to the economy and it employs a lot of people. But not everything in their economy is stuff that I would endorse. Like, I think a sixth of their economy is manufacturing cars.
yeah,
So really, concentrated in that sector. They do much less than we do with, or even other European countries like France with like aviation, biotech, and other tech startups. They're a little behind. They have a surprisingly really inefficient banking system.
Mm,
Western or American and British banks are much more efficient. It's very hard to get credit in Germany. And they have a mercantilist policy of trade, which may not mean anything to your listeners, but it might. But basically, they make it hard for people to consume
mm,
because their economy is geared toward export. And I think this speaks to the current situation where I think um, that alienates their trading partners, and it also they don't have as diversified an economy as we do, and I don't think that's good either.
yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask was, in your time in Germany, did you spend any time working at any of the educational institutes there?
Yes. Uh, uh, well, it was kind of funny because I had to enroll
Mm,
in at the university at the Free University of Berlin in
nice.
order to get my pre-doc fellowship. I was a member of an institute. They have a very different university system. So I was an enrolled student in good standing, even though I didn't take any classes for 5 years.
Mm. And how was that process? I wonder if they're like, that I wonder the culture shock of also just the educational uh culture, or just, what's the word? I mean, just like the process of education there. I wonder how that was and how you felt about that.
Well, on the one hand, I really liked being having student status in
Yeah.
Germany because it gave me a visa
Mm-hmm.
and it gave me subsidies and all kinds of stuff. Like I could go eat at the cafeteria really inexpensively. I could use the Berlin subway system inexpensively, right? And so it was less expensive for me to live in Berlin at that time than to live in the United States. I found a job after my grant money ran out. I found a job teaching English at the German State Bank. So I
Mm,
taught English to bank employees and they paid me pretty well. So I was able to live on just 5 hours a week of work. So I was really
nice.
able to fund my PhD living in Berlin, but I kind of got stuck there because I couldn't afford to move anywhere else.
Mm,
So um, in Berlin, at that time it was an odd place. Berliners weren't called up to army service or national service
mm,
because it was effectively occupied territory by the four powers. So it didn't
yeah.
have the same legal status as other German states. Um, so Berliners couldn't be drafted. So what happened was a lot of people who didn't want to join, young men didn't want to be called into the army or do national service. They would go to Berlin to study,
Mm,
but then they would get stuck there because they were eligible for their service until they were 36. So they would be stuck there for 18 years. So they basically extended their studies. And Berlin had this, I don't know how else to say it, back in the 80s, it kind of had this waster hippie culture of people
yeah.
just hanging out, they call it Dauerstudenten, they're like permanent students, not really working very hard to
Yeah.
complete their degrees, which on the one hand is kind of nice, but on the other hand, like someone is paying for that.
Yeah.
Um, and I was over there, trying very hard to get my stuff done. And after a while, I kind of got annoyed with um, a lot of people were just sort of hanging out forever. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, I was grateful to be in a place that let me be an intellectual really cheaply. Like
Yeah.
I moved back to New York City, and I also lived in New York City on very little money. But boy, the United States is not very forgiving to people who are poor and
Yeah.
people who are studying.
Oh
It's a
yeah.
lot rougher here.
Yeah.
So there's advantages and disadvantages of life in Europe.
One thing I wanted to ask also, was you had written a lot on travel, exploration, and race within the 19th century, and going back to the 19th century. And I wonder, like, how do you approach? I know, and I wonder this for all
Right.
teachers. How do you approach teaching sensitive and or controversial topics like colonial science and or race in a university classroom today?
Sure. I mean, that's an excellent question. So this may sound old-fashioned, but I try to let the facts speak for themselves.
Yeah,
Uh, Quite frankly, race is a concept with little to no scientific value.
yeah,
And I think you could say it explains only 5% of the variance in phenotypes. So it it's not a scientific concept, but it continues to inform our thinking.
yeah,
So a while back, I was invited to write an essay for Science magazine. Very proud of that. You know, uh, Science magazine's a big deal.
yeah,
Um, I happened to run into a kind of editor there who had heard one of my talks on travel and exploration, and she invited me to write this essay on race. And so I had to come up with something. So my question that I tried to answer was, why does this concept persist, even though it doesn't have any validity really
yeah.
scientifically? So my argument was, um, it's more a form of nostalgia,
Mm,
racist nostalgia for a world that has fixed orders rather than an unsettling one of the modern world of capitalism, which doesn't have any fixed orders, or of Darwinian evolution, which doesn't have any fixed species orders, which is constantly churning. And people don't like that. People find that really unsettling
yeah,
that there's no hierarchy. So race is a kind of nostalgia for a pre-modern world. So that's my argument. Um, Now, in these exploration classes, actually, I spend more time talking about culture,
mm,
which is a slippier concept, but no less biased. Um, and I try to um, get students to read firsthand accounts of cultural encounters, how Europeans saw um, other societies, and also even how the other societies saw the Europeans, and maybe get students to challenge some of their assumptions. I should probably add that my attitudes toward these topics have been shaped by the experience of living abroad for over a decade.
yeah.
I mentioned I lived in Germany for 7 years. I also was fortunate to go live in France for a year in high school. And then my first sabbatical, I lived in China for a year.
Oh,
So all these experiences made me realize how relative American values were and made me understand their societies that are based on very different premises that work perfectly well. So a lot of times race and culture, they tend to naturalize just a set of cultural values that don't have any real basis in nature at all. They're fairly arbitrary. They're based on history and accident.
yeah. And it's such a difficult topic too because you know, which the argument you made for that magazine was great because why do we keep coming to this? It's always even today, right as we speak right now, there are arguments and ideas being brought up based on race, and it's such a fascinating. I am fascinated by unintended consequences, and I think race is just one of those things that we have kind of found ourselves stuck in this cement problem of race. It always comes back to this idea that things are based in that, and I completely agree. There is no validity. I think it's just a scientific thing that occurs in humans, and yet we somehow try to base some arguments of culture and civilized and uncivilized people on it. And I
Mhm.
think it's just um ignorance and whatever other word you could use to describe it. And I think it's just fascinating how we still, like you said, are still stuck in it. We still come back to it as always. But
Let
also,
me. Let me
Yeah.
add one point on this. I mean, it is part of our history. It's a nasty and unpleasant part of our history. It's the history of slavery.
Yeah.
I heard from an American historian somewhere. I don't know if the Americanists will correct me. So,
Yeah.
not expert on American history, but I heard that there's three basic narratives of American history. There's the one that I learned growing up in New England, which is a self-congratulatory narrative of progress of Western civilization and European ideas and institutions were perfected, right,
Yeah.
in America. Okay, so that's the narrative of the triumphalist narrative of American history that I've learned. There's also the narrative that's more common out here in Colorado, which is the frontier narrative, that the true story of America is this expanding frontier and the encounter at the border, right,
Yeah.
between Europeans and non-Europeans. That's what shapes American character. But there's a third narrative, and that's the narrative of the South, and that's the narrative of slavery. Slavery is the essential sin of our experience and the experience of the New World. And I think that's as valid an interpretation as the other two narratives. So
Yeah.
I don't think we're really going to get away from this uh, issue. I would just maybe like us to think more um, sensitively about uh, these topics.
Yeah, I think it's so easy for some people to brush it off like, oh, it just
Yeah.
happened. And you're right, it did just happen, but the 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 unintended consequences of slavery are still felt today in the United States of America, and it's fascinating, fascinating. I got one more question for
Okay.
you, and this one I really was excited to ask because I think it's a call to action for the future. And so I wonder, as a historian, how do you see your role in shaping students, their skills, and understanding the modern world? I think, as historians, um, we can study the past, but
Hmm.
also I think as we study the past, there are tools that we can learn from doing that to look at the present. And I wonder what your message or method you hope to carry with them beyond your courses and as they go out into society and the world.
Okay, that's a really good question and hard one to answer. Um, some people say history is just one damn thing after another.
Yeah.
There's no story and
Yeah.
to it. That's perfectly valid interpretation of it.
Hmm.
Uh, Personally, I guess I'd stress 3 points. Okay, the first is kind of practical for students, and that is like learning isn't an achievement. Getting a degree is an achievement, but learning isn't an achievement. It's a habit. All
Yeah.
right. It's not like you're done when you're 21 and you get out of college. Reading, thinking, asking questions, something you have to do your whole life. It's like saying I'm done with exercise at age 21. Like no,
Yeah.
most people wouldn't think that, right? So same thing. You have to use your brain your whole life, or you'll become really stupid.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so I encourage students to keep learning, keep thinking. Okay. Second, as far as history, I would characterize the most important transformation in the modern world as the intellectual shift from structure to function,
Mm.
from kind of typological thinking to a kind of functional thinking. Or in plainer terms, maybe I could say how things act is more important than what they are. And I think that this is true in almost every area of culture and society, from class being defined by a hierarchy to class being defined by what you do,
Mm.
to a shift in scientific thinking from typological thinking which is structural, to functional thinking. Darwin himself went through this shift in his understanding of species as types to species as defined by how they interact with their environment. And then I also think this is true in the world today. I guess the term would be anti-essentialist. I don't think that there are essences to things. I think things are defined by how they work.
Yeah.
Um, and that is a difficult and important concept for people to grasp, but I think it's true.
Mm,
And finally, let me say, ethically or moralistically, that transformation is neither good nor bad.
mm.
That the transition from typological to functional thinking, something's lost and something's gained. It's neither progress nor decline. It's just change. And that's important to keep in mind because there's no reason to be overly optimistic, but there's also no reason to despair about the
Yeah.
modern world. Sometimes what I say to students is most problems can't be fixed, they can only be managed. So understanding that functional approach or having that functional approach to the world helps you manage things as opposed to trying to fix them. And I think that's an important lesson both for individuals and for societies.
I love that. I love the idea that most problems cannot be fixed but can be managed. And I think a lot of them, I think oftentimes people come into the world as public servants or whatever it may be, trying to fix certain problems, which I admire, but I think the ugly truth is that they can't be, they can only be managed. So, Professor, thank you for being on here. Thanks for stopping by and talking to us. I really do appreciate it. I absolutely loved what we talked about today. And keep on teaching, keep on doing that work. I love teaching. I love teaching. I love teachers. I love educators. It's, something I aspire to be one day. So thanks again, Professor.
Thank you. It's been a real privilege.
Thank
Thank you
you.